Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my LCK Week 3 overview, analysis, and of course, at the end, my updated power rankings. The LCK is the shortest league that I cover now on this channel every single week, which is insane to say, considering it's best of 3 and they play 5 days a week. But when you look at, the pace of schedule that everybody else in the year is going on right now, yeah, actually, these are the shortest videos I put out, so pretty wild to end up saying that. But there are some interesting matchups. I know it's been a little bit predictable this year in the LCK, but I think this week there were some things to talk about, so I'm excited to get into this video. But let me know what your opinions and thoughts are down in the comments section below. Of course, what teams are overperforming, underperforming your expectations. I'd love to hear who's exciting you and who's kind of disappointing you up until this point this year. I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts and feedback just in general on what's going on in the LCK. But without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into the recap. Of course, if you're new here, what we do is we go series by series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team is able to generate. I will be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series. At the end of the week, I will be giving a power rankings for all 10 teams, and then of course I'll also be giving a player of the week and a dud of the week, and so a full comprehensive analysis of the LCK here in week number 3, and we get to start it off with day number 1, and we kick day 1 off with a matchup between Liiv, SANDBOX, and OK BRION that SANDBOX is going to be able to take. It's a 2-1 series win. It wasn't quite as dominant as maybe you would want from SANDBOX in a series like this. This is a team that certainly has not started out the year all that hot, but their schedule has been relatively tough. They're a team that we know is probably towards the bottom of the upper quadrant of teams, if you will, top 6. At least last split felt very determined, and there really weren't a lot of changes in the offseason. Liiv SANDBOX making one of the more impactful ones by bringing Teddy in as their new starting AD carry, but they were a good team, and it doesn't really feel like they have upgraded themselves all too much. And yes, they were able to win this series, and they were able to win a couple of games here, but it really didn't feel all that dominant. You wanted to see them go up against a team in Bro that really has not looked good almost at all at any point this split outside of that one random series against Dplus KIA, and you wanted to see them actually just be able to beat them pretty handily. And while they were able to win, it wasn't quite at the level that I think a lot of SANDBOX fans were probably looking for. My player of the series is going to go to Closer in the mid lane. This was kind of up in the air because I don't think Closer was particularly consistent throughout this entire series, but man, like Static Shiv LeBlanc in game number 3, that really is what is the big takeaway from this series, is that Static Shiv LeBlanc is really strong. There were a lot of misplays coming out from SANDBOX in both games 2 and 3 that really could have caused them to end up losing this series, but that champion and that item combo is just so ridiculously strong that the amount of damage that Closer was able to put out was phenomenal enough in game number 3 that it basically secured the series for SANDBOX. Now, he, again, like I said, wasn't perfect across this whole series. His game number 1 on the Nico, he was probably the worst performer on SANDBOX, and it's not like he was very good in game number 2 either. It was just that closeout game number 3, where he was good, and I didn't really feel like anybody else on this team was consistent enough to be able to give that award to. The other player that I think you could consider in that kind of vein would have been Bertle in the top lane, who I think actually also had a pretty good series. He was good in game 1 on the Gnar, maybe a little overstated for his impact, but he was also pretty solid in game number 3 on the Jax. And so both of their wins, I felt he was more consistent, but I don't think he had the same kind of individual performance in one game that Closer did in that third and final one. So if you want to give it to Bertle, I understand. If you want to give it to Closer, I also understand. I'm going to personally give it to Closer. Teddy was fine. He's just who we thought he is. He's a great team fighter, somebody who's going to be consistent enough to be able to, scale up into the late game and keep this team in a lot of games, even in situations where they're really not doing all that well and they're making quite a few mistakes. That was kind of the case in game number 1, but he's really not going to change the fortune of this team all that much. He's just going to kind of make the rest of these players look a little bit more consistent, which is fine. It's a good thing to add to the team, and I certainly think that he has been an upgrade to what this team had in the spring split, but I don't think he's this game-changing bot laner. Kale actually had a pretty rough series, I would say, overall. Scoreline definitely doesn't indicate that, but a pretty rough game number 1, a couple of really botched engages on the Rakan. He was much better towards the back half of the series, especially on the Nami in game number 3, but it certainly could have been a little bit more consistent, and Wheeler just hasn't clicked in that same way that he did in the spring split, in my opinion. This was somebody who was really breaking out, an all-pro caliber player in spring, and really has just not kicked off summer with the same kind of aggression and tempo that I think he really had a really good control of in spring split. So Certainly for SANDBOX, I think that there are good takeaways from this, but there are also more questionable takeaways and things that I think you would be a little bit more concerned about for a team that does want to make playoffs. And then for Bro, they're just not very good. Ivory is still going to be in there, and it looks like Effort is still going to be in there. And so this looks like the 5-man roster that they're going to be using moving forward. And honestly, Effort was pretty good in this series. I would argue that he was probably their most consistent member, so that was a positive. Henna had some good moments, but Effort actually set him up super well in a lot of different scenarios. Not something that I usually say on this channel, but I think the bot lane was far from the problem for Bro. I think that jungle was a major issue for this team. Umti's going to get my dud of the series. It just didn't feel like he had any sort of pressure, especially on that Nico in game number 3. We're not really seeing it be brought out a lot in the jungle, but we're seeing junglers try to get a little bit more creative with what their champion pool is looking like at the current moment. We've been seeing Sion, Nico, a couple of champions that aren't necessarily as known. Even the Jax we've seen in a couple situations be brought into that jungle position, and it's just not working in the same way that I think it is for a lot of the meta junglers right now. It really does feel like the Wukong and the Vi and the Sedge are all still your top tier picks. They're all still your best junglers in the meta at the current moment, and when you kind of go off meta like this and try something a little bit different, it very rarely works in the same kind of way as the consistency of everything else, and Umti, I think, learned that the hard way in game number 3. He's fine. We talked about him last week. We've talked about him for years on this channel. He's a player who's going to have 2-3 games every single split where it's like, oh my god, is Umti actually good? And then every other game's going to be disappointing, and so that's just who he is as a player. Inconsistent, but sometimes very good. It's just not going to be the case over the course of an entire split. Morgan was fine. People really like him. He's okay. I thought Bertle was better in this series, especially in lane, but Morgan's certainly not a problem, and I think top lane is far from the issue. Ivory really has not made an impact in the mid lane ever since joining this team. I was definitely concerned about Karis before he ended up getting replaced, but it doesn't really feel like Ivory has been much of an upgrade for this team. At the very least, he's not a disaster in this series, but he was really bad last week going into, admittedly, some very tough competition, and you want to see some improvement come out of him as well. But for Bro, there really is just a lot that this team needs to figure out. They don't feel particularly talented, and they also don't feel like they particularly have great macro, and that's kind of the makings of a bottom team in the league. Yes, they had that miracle win over Dplus KIA, but that more so felt like a miracle rather than something that was actually sustainable by this team. And then for SANDBOX on the other side, they're fine, I guess. This series honestly made me more concerned than any of the series that they had played up until this point. At least they were able to take care of some of the other teams that were kind of on the fringe. Their one series before this, they looked all right that they were able to win, and their 3 losses were to good teams, but this is a not very good Bro team, and they looked very contentious in this series, and so SANDBOX is starting to concern me. There are not really all that many teams that are going to be rushing for that number 6 spot, but it really does feel like that last playoff spot here in the LCK could be up for grabs. And now we get to move on to our second series of day number 1, and it's a decent matchup, one that I think people are excited about the result of. We had the Kwangdong Freecs taking on T1, and T1 was able to take the 2-0 series win. Definitely the better team in this circumstance, continuing to propagate, I guess, this idea that the top 6 really are just kind of locked, even though it really is turning into a top 5, and very quickly might be even turning into a top 4 or even a top 3 in terms of actual consistent teams. But T1 in that upper tier, however you want to slice it. And even though they did lose to Gen.G, I still think that the consistency that comes with this roster is pretty immense, and I think they continued to play really well in this series. My player of the series is going to go to Owner in the jungle. This is a player who I think has been really, slept on a lot over the course of this split so far. He hasn't exactly been the most outstanding player of all time. He hasn't lived up to maybe some of the expectations that he has set for himself over the past few splits, where he's just pretty clearly been one of the best junglers in the entire world. Really has not kicked off this split being such, but 2 really good games of Poppy here against a KDF team that usually does a good job of neutralizing early threats in the jungle. Now, we'll obviously get into KDF's problems because none of them are surprising to anybody who watches KDF's games, but it is good to see Owner continuing to kind of step up his game. I think if he continues to grow and kind of get back to his regular form by the middle or the end of this split, I'm really not going to be all that surprised, and I'm certainly not going to be concerned. I see so many people online talking about how he's just been unplayable this year and yada yada yada. T1 fans are absolutely psycho, and we all kind of know that they hold their players to expectations that are just unrealistic. Players are going to have cold stretches. The single best players in the world all have cold stretches. There's just not a single player that has not undergone on some rough stretch of time for 2 or 3 or 4 weeks or whatever, Owner's fine. He's a great player, and he's going to be able to figure it out, and hopefully this was the step in that direction to say that it's almost over now, and so that was good. Guma and KIA have been phenomenal, arguably the best bot lane in the LCK. I would say inarguable. In my opinion, they are the best bot lane in the LCK, but I think some people might argue that. To me, it's just been fantastic what we've seen them be able to do. KIA has really adapted to this new meta really well. His Milio is fantastic, one of the best that we've seen at the competitive level, and Gumayushi's just, like, phenomenal. Like, mechanically speaking, he is a top 1 or top 2 AD carry in the world. Like, him and Jackie Love are the 2 AD carries that I look at and just go, like, you're unfair. Mechanically speaking, it's just, like, unfair to have to play into you. He does everything he needs to do at such a high level. He's just really, really fun to watch, and a player that I think is going to continuously push T1 forward if they want to invest a lot of late-game resources into him, like they did in this series. 2 games of Faker's Azir, he was good. Zeus dominated Dudu on the top side of this map, who I like in the top lane. Zeus honestly just looked fantastic. Again, go on any sort of Reddit comment thread, you're going to see a bunch of people saying that Zeus actually isn't that good because he chokes in the finals. It's an absurd statement to make, but, you know, T1 fans, again, they hold their team to such high standards, such unrealistic expectations that, you know, their mind ends up getting a little bit clouded with the results that they end up getting. This player has made World Finals for a reason. This player has been an MVP caliber player ever since he joined the LCK for a reason. He's still arguably the best top laner in the entire world, and he continues to show that, especially in laning phase. And so T1's still very good, and they took care of KDF here. And then for KDF on the other side, they're just not going to be able to keep up with a team like T1, as good as they are in the early game. And trust me, they were good, especially a player like Bulldog, I think, made some interesting plays at the beginning of these games. Ezreal, Tristana, some marksmen coming out in the mid lane for him. It just wasn't going to be enough because this team still has the same major issue that they've had all year long, which is the fact that their mid and late games are horrendously bad. They have no idea how to play the map, and this is something that I brought up last week. You always hear that, like, oh, they're a young team. They're going to be able to figure it out. Their macro is going to get better, but why would we expect that? Like, I hate to say it, but when you throw 5 players who have never really shown the ability to have good macro together, why do you think that them playing together for a longer period of time is just suddenly going to teach them good macro? You've got to have somebody here that can teach them what the right and wrong decisions are. If you just let them have bad macro forever, they're never going to learn what the good macro looks like. And so that's a problem and something that is actually concerning about KDF, and it definitely was the case again in this series. My dud of the series is going to go to Taiyun. I think you could very realistically give this to June in the support position and Dudu in the top lane as well. They were the 3 worst players in this series by a considerable margin, but I think the bot gap for me was very noticeable, and is, you know, I really wanted to praise Owner on the other side, but I also wanted to show that Guma and KIA definitely were the better bot lane, and that is going to be with Taiyun getting my dud of the series. Still think that Taiyun is like a lower tier AD carry at this level. He's had a couple of good games here and there. Consistently has been fine, but for the most part, I think is still going to cause this team, you know, a little bit of problems down in the bot lane. I don't think this bot lane's very good. It's one of the worst in the LCK, and I think they continuously prove that every time they go up against a bot lane that isn't also very contentious. But Dudu having a bad series, I think, is really not good for KDF. They really need him to play well in order to win. We've seen that over the course of this split and last split as well, where he's been one of the better top laners in the LCK. And then Youngjae's fine. I always talk about him. I say the same thing every time. He's fine. He's an okay player. Bulldog's good, especially early on in lane, but this team's team fighting is still atrocious, and that's something that they're really going to need to figure out if they want to win games. And then for T1, they look solid. They're 4-1. Their only losses to Gen.G. This team is good. It's just going to be about being able to get over the hump. The regular season, I feel pretty good about. And then moving on now to day number 2, and we kick day 2 off with a battle between maybe the best team in the league versus maybe the worst team in the league. We had Gen.G taking on DRX. And of course, Gen.G was able to take the 2-0 series win, as they should have here. If there was any problems, that would have been very concerning for Gen.G, but no, it was a complete stomp of a series. Gen.G was definitely better, and they looked it in every single game, basically in every aspect of the game. Couple of members in particular that were definitely standouts, but even look at the scores. 11-0 game 1, 15-2 game 2. It's not close. The series wasn't even remotely up in the air, basically ever. Pressure was never on the side of anyone other than Gen.G, and it was really impressive stuff, and it just goes to show how far DRX really has fallen from grace. They really might be the worst team in the LCK at the current moment, but let's go ahead and talk about it. My player of the series is going to go to Doran in the top lane, and I'm really excited to talk about this because, again, this just goes back to everything I've been saying over the course of this year so far, and that's the tape isn't lying. Like, watching these players and watching every single game, I think gives me a unique perspective on a lot of these players that I think a lot of the community just doesn't have or doesn't want to have, quite frankly, because the amount of comments that I was seeing, and the fact that this matchup is the one that I get to talk about this in, I think is very apropos, because the amount of comments, not just last week, but, you know, in a lot of different weeks, even last split as well, that was like, Rascal is super hard stuck on this DRX team. None of these losses are his fault. He's just, you know, trying his best, and the rest of the team's not able to keep up, yada, yada, yada. And I'm sitting there being like, I don't know what games you're watching that I'm not, but Rascal is consistently losing in lane. His team fighting has regressed considerably. He's been one of the worst top laners in the league. And I'm not saying that he can't get back to being good. I'm just saying that to absolve him of all the problems, I think, is naive, right? That's the point I've been trying to make. But, you know, what really pushed me over the edge last week in particular was the comment that said, if you took Rascal off of DRX and put him on Gen.G, he would be better for this team than Doran, because he's a better laner and a better player than Doran. And that was something that I talked about a lot in my video last week. It's just like an absurd thing to say, something that only someone who's not taking it seriously, even remotely, would say. And clearly that was the case, because we got to see them 1v1 in lane this series. No jungle assistance really from either side, and Doran just punished him over and over and over and over again. I mean, he obliterated him in lane, both games, especially game 2, where it was just like not even close. I mean, it was solo kill after solo kill. Like, this looked like me versus Doran in this matchup, and so excited for Doran, because I think this is a player that is consistently slept on by most of the community. Even I sleep on him quite a bit. He's someone who I've ranked pretty consistently at like 3 or 4 in terms of the top laners in the LCK, and while I do agree that he's somewhere in that ranking, he can play near the top of that ranking. This dude was finals MVP for me for a reason this past split. It's because he's really freaking good in the top lane, especially when games matter the most. He's a great laner, he can be a really consistent team fighter, and he's good with resources. He's kind of just a jack of all trades kind of player, and I think he can really do all of them at a high level, and so really good to see him have another really good series here. Bot lane continues to be a big strength. I've gushed about Pays all split long. He's certainly in MVP conversation for me, if not completely leading it right now in the LCK. Like, he's just been awesome. Delight has been really solid. I think this has been his most consistent split, at least in terms of what he's been able to put out on the Rift. Obviously, you know, he was really good in spring, but I think this split has been game to game a little bit more consistent. I think I've noticed him at least a little bit more, and the fact that I'm bringing up Peanut and Chovy last in terms of effect on this series just goes to show you where Gen.G is at. Not that they played poorly at all. Chovy in particular was phenomenal, but Peanut was also really good, especially on the Maokai in game number 2, and that control, that tempo that he was able to generate really did kind of bleed into the rest of the lanes, but everybody on Gen.G won, and it's not like that's a particularly massive surprise. It's just good to see. And then for DRX on the other side, they're not good. They're arguably the worst team in the entire LCK. 2 substitutions this series. Juhan is officially in for Krako, and Fate is coming back in here for Yehu. I don't know if that's going to be like a long-term substitution. I don't know if they're just practicing as a duo. You know, that we see a lot of teams, I should say, take players in and out as a duo rather than, you know, one or the other, because they have practiced together a little bit more often. So I'm not sure if that's necessarily the case for DRX, but needless to say, it didn't really matter in this series because they just got blasted either way. Dud of the series is no-brainer Rascal. He was miserable in this series. This was one of the worst top lane performances that anyone has had in the LCK, and I see a lot of people saying, like, he's probably just mental boomed. Yeah, he probably is mental boomed. I know he's a talented player. Go back a year. I hate being the one to be negative on Rascal, because I got a ton of flack last year, especially in Spring Split of 2022, for saying Rascal's one of the best top laners in the world, mechanics speaking. So, I trust me more than anybody hates being low on Rascal, but I'm not going to just completely ignore what I see on the Rift, and I think this is a big reason why Reddit gets kind of a bad rap in terms of the community. It's because people overreact, and people, you know, I can't expect everybody to watch all the games, but people just take narratives completely out of context, and it makes you look really dumb. And so, you know, again, I'm not trying to call out Reddit for being entirely stupid, even though I think for the most part they have mostly bad takes. I think that Rascal is fine as a player, and if you took him out of this environment, he might be better, but he's not been perfect. You can't ignore the fact that he has been part of the problem for this team. Juhan got completely out-jungled. Again, the amount of people that said take Krako out, put Juhan in, all of the problems for DRX are fixed. Like, it's a black and white solution. Like, one player would be causing what's going on with DRX is absurd. Juhan coming in was just as bad like he was in spring as Krako was, and I don't imagine that there's going to be a lot that they can do in the jungle position. Fate is whatever. It was already bad in spring. Don't expect a huge change of pace. Paddock and Beryl don't have any chemistry together. Both of them are way too aggressive, especially towards the back half of games, and they don't have the mechanics to be able to back it up, and they certainly don't have the map state to be able to back it up, and so it just feels like DRX is kind of trapped in this perpetual motion of being a bottom tier team, and I don't expect it to change all that much. And then for Gen.G, they look like they're the best team in the LCK. There really is no other way to say it right now. Until proven otherwise, they're the best team in the LCK. When Doran can step up and be the player of a series, that's huge. Pays and Delight are MVP caliber bot lane right now, and then you have Peanut and Chovy in the mid and jungle. Like, this is a fantastic team, and they really have bounced back even better than I could have ever anticipated from winning that spring split. And then moving on to our second series here of day number 2, and it's a really intriguing one. 2 3-1 teams that have both looked pretty good. We had KT Rolster taking on Dplus KIA, and KT Rolster does pick up the victory here, and it's a 2-0. It's not even a 2-1. They're able to take both games against DK in this series, and man, that's a pretty impressive feat. Yes, DK is certainly not in the best form that they could possibly be in, but I think people are overrating the fact that they ended up losing to Bro. This team has actually looked pretty good outside of that. At the beginning of this split, Showmaker in particular, I think, has started off strong. Deft and Kellen are fantastic in the early 2v2. This team definitely has a lot of positives, and there is talent on this team, but KT Rolster's damn good. They are legit. I think at this point we can no longer contest them. We can no longer question it. They're a top 3 team at worst here in the LCK, and a team that we need to start considering for one of the more interesting teams in the entire world. That's where we have to be with KT at this point. They were awesome in this series in particular. My player of the series was actually kind of tough, but I'm going to give it to Liiv in the support position. Really good engages coming out from him. He's just such an explosive player to watch. Really, every worry and question mark that I've had for Liiv over the course of his whole career, that I've been very vocal about on this channel, going back to his time on Afrika, and then obviously talking about his time, last year, I was saying that he benefited a lot from being able to play with Ruler, and I didn't expect him to be able to carry it over to this KT Rolster team. I was completely wrong. He has absolutely been able to carry it over to KT Rolster. He's still been one of the best supports in the entire world, and he's been really, really fun to watch. He's my player of the series here. I know scoreline doesn't necessarily indicate that, but don't look at scoreline for supports. Watch the film. You've got to watch the film, and Liiv pops in every single fight, in every single early laning phase. He makes his presence known, more so than almost anybody else in the entire game, and so good stuff overall from him. Keen was the other player that you simply had to consider. Pulling out the Quinn in game number 1 is obviously super fun. Really happy he was able to do that, but really just dominating that top lane matchup, not making it easy for Kana to actually play this game. He's had a little bit of a rough start to the summer split, and I know people are really going to be quick to get on him in terms of, calling for his head, but Keen's a really good player. Getting outplayed by Keen is certainly not indicative of not being a good enough top laner. I think that the elite top laners in the LCK are definitely just better than everybody else, and Keen is definitely in that category. But Keen and Liiv, the standout members, BDD, Aiming, and Cuz were still really good. This team just operates really well as a unit, and I think that really is the most impressive part to me, is you can have really talented players. I mean, look at the other side of this map. Canyon, Showmaker, Deft, Kellen, all world-class in their roles, and Kana's not like a slouch. He's just not, elite, in my opinion. But they're not able to put it together nearly in the same kind of way that a team like KT is. They're good in the early game, they're really good in the mid game, and they know how to close out games. Every single thing about this team being inconsistent and not being good game to game, and all the worries that we were kind of throwing on them label-wise when we came into spring, I think they've outplayed all of them at this point. This is one of the best teams in the world, and they've been a lot of fun to watch. And then for DK, I'm not going to say you should start to get concerned, but it really does not feel like this is a top 3 team in the LCK, and that is a little bit of a problem with the roster that you have put together. My dud of the series is going to go to Canyon in the jungle. Not the first game, and certainly won't be the last that Canyon underperforms in the regular season. He did this a lot last year in 2022 as well, when people forget that they were calling for his head before he had a fantastic, world championship tournament. But, go back and look at the LCK videos that I posted in 2022, and you're going to see comment sections just filled with the fact that I'm overrating Canyon and that he's been awful, and it's ridiculous that I'm still considering him a top jungler. Fast forward, obviously, and that, I hate to say it, but obviously I was right. It was such a no-brainer decision to say that Canyon was going to bounce back, but another slow start to a split for him here, and it's certainly something to consider. Hate the Xin Zhao pick. I think it's not playable in the current meta, and I think it's just a waste of a jungle spot. And Canyon, I think, definitely started to feel that in game 2, but it's not like he was particularly good on Maokai in game number 1 either. I just don't think he looked all that comfortable in this series, really, at any point. Showmaker continues to pick these scaling-oriented picks like the Aurelion Soul and just not really having any sort of impact on the game. That's going to be a little bit of a problem. His LeBlanc was better, but it still wasn't good enough. Deft and Kellen didn't win lane nearly at the level that they should have. Lucian Milia was certainly an interesting idea, but it just didn't end up working out. I like the quote-unquote innovation coming out from them. It's 2 meta champions just that aren't played together, but they still need to be a little bit better. And like I said, Kana's just not a superstar on the top side of this map, and that's going to be a little bit of a problem when you play, people people like Keen in the LCK here are going to be able to dominate you. Lucky for them, there really aren't any other teams other than KT and T1 that are going to be able to take advantage of that top side in that same way, but DK has some question marks, especially when it comes to team play. This team just feels very lost, and it feels like that they don't exactly know how they want to play the game. Deft and Kellen like to play early. Canyon and Showmaker like to scale. Canyon picking Xin Zhao wants to be an early game aggressor and then gets outplayed by Cuz's Viego. It's just a lot of concerning plays coming in from this team. I think they can clean it up, but I don't really like the spot that they're in right now. And then for KT, they're looking great. This is a top 3 team, like I said, at worst, and really they do have the potential to be even better than that. This could be one of the best teams in the entire world. Then moving on to day number 3, the middle of the week here in the LCK, and our middle week matchup was a little bit of an interesting one between the Kwangdong Freecs and Nongshim RedForce, and KDF does pick up another win here. I mean, they really are the gatekeepers of the bottom half of this league, really. This is a team that should be competing for a top 6 spot. I mean, the way that they have been able to perform against some of the worst teams in the league, the 3 teams that are below them, has been very admirable. Of course, their schedule is only going to get harder from here. Basically, every series that was supposed to be easy up until this point has now come and gone for this team, but they have yet to be able to take a series against any of the top 6 teams in the league. Hopefully, they're going to be able to carry over some of the form from this series, though, because their players continue to look good, and we know who the big carry player for this team is. You're not going to hear this brought up a lot on other, people's analysis of KDF, but truly, the best player for KDF, and the player that has been the best for them across this entire year, is Dudu in the top lane. The dude has been terrific, legitimately an upper tier top laner in the LCK, and I hate to say it, but this is one of my best takes. This is another take that I think I've looked really, really good on in recent weeks. And so really, really excited to have said that. I talked about last year Dudu being super good for just a disastrous Hanwha Life team that really had nothing going for them. And I was really high on him. And honestly, nobody else was really saying that at the time. So to see him really break out, or continue, I should say, to break out for KDF this year, it's very vindicating. And again, it goes to show, I promise I do watch all these games. And I promise sometimes I do get these things right. I would say most of the time I'm right. And then obviously I'm going to get some stuff wrong too. I'm not trying to pretend I'm perfect, but it's good to know the process is definitely working. This is just another example of that. But Dudu is player of the series. He did the most damage in game number 2 on the Poppy. I mean, it's actually absurd to be able to deal the most damage in the entire game on Poppy of all champions, but he was just so far ahead of Din Din. Also, Dudu versus Din Din, the dream matchup. Really excited to be able to watch that, but, Dudu's just fantastic. He's one of the best top laners in the LCK, like, full stop, legit. I would probably put him number 4 right now. I think top 3 is just super solid with obviously Zeus, and then Keen, and then Doran. I think those 3 are just the 3 best top laners in the league, but Dudu's right there at number 4 for me. You want to put him with Kana, you want to put him with basically any of these other top laners that are good. Bertle, I think, is in that zone. Dudu, to me, has been more consistent than them, and I really like how he's been able to play, so big ups to him. Bulldog is very good, and I know a lot of people would say that he is the best player on this team. I think he's a little bit too inconsistent and a little bit too, I need to carry games in order for me to consider him the best player on this team, but he certainly is a talented player and someone who has really good upside, and he was very good for them in spring. He's been a little bit less proactive, I would say, in summer so far, which isn't something that is going to be a major issue for this team, but he's been more of a secondary carry, and honestly, that's been, better for my opinion of him overall. Really like what we've seen from him. Youngjae had probably his best series as a pro in this one. Yes, he was going into Sylvie, who has struggled at this level, but really like what we saw out of him. And Taiyun and June were fine. They were certainly good enough, and they were put on some late game hyper carry, so all they really needed to do was survive. I think KDF actually looked really good in this series, and I was really happy with what we saw. But for Nongshim on the other side, in their first series of the week, we had a couple of mid laners in here, some back and forth movement. First of all, Jiwoo is still in there at AD carry, which is really good to see. Like I said before, I think he was the right choice to bring in and play AD carry for this team, reuniting him with a lot of these Nongshim players that he did play with, and we finally got the full Nongshim Challengers roster in game number 2 here, because Quad was miserable in game number 1, so much so that he is going to get my dud of the series, but Fiesta ends up coming in. We get the full Nongshim Challengers roster of Din Din, Sylvie, Fiesta, Jiwoo, Peter in game 2. Unfortunately, it's not enough for them to be able to win, but Jiwoo is definitely the best player on this team, and it's pretty clear that he is elevating the level of the rest of this team as well. I'm not sure if it's going to matter. I'm not sure if it's actually going to be able to translate into wins, but this is a good addition to the team, and he is better than Vital, which is something I said at the beginning of the year. Really happy that that kind of came to fruition. But like I said, Quad was miserable in that game 1 on the Tristana. He ended up getting benched. You're going to need to find someone to play mid lane for this Nongshim team because nobody that they've really put into that circumstance has actually been able to come out of it looking good. Quad was miserable in game 1. Fiesta was okay in game 2. Going to be interested to see where they go in future series, but Sylvie continues to be not very good in the jungle as much as I liked him in Challengers. Din Din got run over in the top lane like he is in pretty much every single series that he's played, and Peter's just fine. Him and Jiwoo were definitely the best part of the team, and it's cool to see Neela in pro play. Always interesting to see new picks come out in the AD carry position, but it's not a particularly strong pick, and so I can see why it wasn't necessarily creating a lot of plays. But overall, Nongshim is just the team that we think they are. Bottom 3 feel pretty locked in the LCK at the moment, and Nongshim is in that. But for KDF, they're right above that bottom 3. This is a team that can figure out a way to maybe get on the same level as a team like Liiv SANDBOX or Hanwha Life Esports. Would love to see them in that kind of conversation, but the inconsistency that they've shown has just been a little bit too drastic, and they still do have their, late game macro problems, but man, the individual talent, especially of these solo laners, is actually very good. And then we get to move on to our second series here of day number 3, and it's actually kind of an intriguing matchup. Two teams that are pretty close in terms of public perception at the moment. We had Hanwha Life Esports taking on Liiv SANDBOX, and Hanwha Life is able to pick up the victory. Now, I'm gonna do a couple of housekeeping efforts as this video is going out, because there has been some news that has arisen in recent days that I would be remiss not to discuss on this channel. I don't know how to talk about Klid right now. I'm just going to make a little bit of a disclaimer at the beginning of the video. For those who aren't aware, go to Twitter. I don't really want to go into it on this channel, but there's some scandal, some bad news has come out about Klid and about him talking to minors in a very inappropriate way. And if all of the allegations are true, which at this point in time, at the point in time I'm recording this, they look to be very true. I hope he never plays in the LCK again. There's plenty of talent in the LCK and in the pipeline for League of Legends, way more than is necessary to make sure that people like this don't deserve a spot. Because, I mean, truly, like, if you're going to be a piece of shit, just give the spot to somebody else. There are plenty of good junglers in the world that can figure this out, but that's all I'm going to say on it. Obviously, I don't really want to touch on those allegations here, but I figured I should say something because it would just be weird to talk about Klid and not bring it up considering the context that we know in modern times. And so let's go ahead and talk about the series in general. I'm going from one kind of aside to a rant. First of all, player of the series, Viper. Second all, if you've watched my channel, if you watch these videos, if you're familiar with the LCK content, especially last week's or specifically week 1, if you watched week 1 in this series and got to that Gen.G T1 series, you know I went on this massive rant about how stupid it is that all Reddit talks about when Zeri wins is Zeri, because statistically, first of all, it's not even true, right? Zeri's got a 50% win rate globally. In certain regions like the LPL, she's even lower than that, 41%. And so this is not a champion that, like, yes, she's strong, but she's not an insta-win like anybody on Reddit would like to make you believe. But yet another instance of a player's ability and skill and talent getting undervalued because he was playing the strong champion. Viper was phenomenal in this game. If you have almost any other AD carry, you don't win this game number 3. Liiv SANDBOX wins this third game of this series, but you have the best AD carry in the LCK, and so you won. That was the only reason you won, was Viper being really freaking good. And just because he was able to do that on Zeri doesn't mean that Zeri is the only thing that we should be talking about. It's an absurd thing to even say in the first place, but it really was the case. Viper was awesome. He continues to be great. I don't like the narrative, and I've talked about this in the past a lot. I don't like the narrative of Viper and 4, wards for players to be carried, because Zeka has been fantastic for this team, basically across the whole year, but especially so far in summer. Those two are really the two that I think have stepped up and really been the primary players for this team. To say that it's just Viper would be to discount how well Zeka is playing at the current moment, which is obviously something LCK fans have done regularly over the course of his career, but those two are really keeping this team afloat when a lot of the rest of the players really aren't stepping up. But Viper's great. Zeka was phenomenal. I shouldn't say even, especially on the Azir in game number 3, where his team fighting is actually just ludicrous. I remember at some points last year, we were saying he couldn't play this champion. Talk about role reversals. He's so freaking good on Azir now. Showed that off at Worlds, and he continues to show it here. But the rest of the team definitely struggled. Klid in particular was really bad in this series and definitely tried to run it down in game number 3 on the Vi, but Vi engages can only go so wrong, so at the very least, they were able to continue to win the series. Kangen was was whatever, didn't really make any sort of impact in life, really didn't do much either. It really was just Zeka and Viper carrying Hanwha life across the finish line. And man, if that is not a summary of how this split has gone for this team, I don't really know what is. But for SANDBOX on the other side, they're just fine, right? They're an okay team. They probably should have won this game number 3, and they probably should have won this series. There were a couple of players that played well. Of course, Teddy still showing that he can play. Him and Kale actually had a great game number 2 on the Varus Leona. Really not a bot lane that we're seeing pulled out. Really neither pick being all that popular in the meta, but both of them making it look incredibly proficient in game 2. They could have done a lot more in game 3, in my opinion, especially Teddy, who I just wish was a little bit more aggressive, but they were more than good enough to, kind of get off scot-free, I will say. Dud of the series for me, though, is going to go to Closer in the mid lane. Just I don't want to say the opposite of what happened in the first series of the week for them, but I talked about Closer just not having a great series and then all of a sudden looking really good on the LeBlanc in game number 3, so I basically had to give him player of the series because he was the one who ended up winning the game-defining game. And, in this one, I think it's a little bit different, where he really wasn't all that bad in this series, but he was just so irrelevant, I think, throughout, especially that third and final game, that it really couldn't go to anybody else. Willer was great in game 3, even if he was miserable in game number 1, probably the worst game of the series. And then Bertle just didn't really have that much of an impact, but I honestly didn't dislike how he played. I think you could make the argument he was even the better top laner in this series, and so for me, it basically had to go to Closer. I think you could give this to Clid on the other side of the map, and I really wouldn't be all that against it, but for now, Closer getting done of the series kind of makes up for the fact that he got kind of a weak player of the series early on in the week, so things equal out in the end, but Teddy and Kale were definitely the primary focus, and that's kind of been Liiv SANDBOX. I'm not even really all that high on Teddy and Kale and what they've been able to do. Teddy consistently gets this perception of being a 1v9 machine on whatever team he's on, and I've just never seen him like that. Like Jin Air, obviously, he had some moments like that, but he's just not aggressive enough to be given that tag. He's not going to win you games by himself. He's just not that kind of player, but he is going to do his role at a very high level, and I do think he did that in this series. I think I'm a little bit lower on his upside, and by proxy, the upside of SANDBOX, and I think that definitely came into fruition in this series. And then Hanwha looked good enough. Like I said, Zeka and Viper are playing at a super high level. If they can get almost anybody else in this team to play up to that standard, they could be a team that actually makes a run, but for now, it's just hard to find any sort of trust in them. And then moving on to day number 4 here, and we kicked day 4 off with a very intriguing matchup that did go at least a little bit as planned. We had Dplus KIA taking on Gen.G, and Gen.G does get the job done, although DK is able to take a game off of them, which really not a lot of teams up until this point in the LCK season have. I know that there is this sense of doom and gloom that surrounds DK just constantly, but there's a real chance that they went up against the 2 best teams in the LCK this week, and they actually took a game off of Gen.G, which is a very difficult thing to do, and so we're going to kind of talk about them in maybe a more positive light than some of you listening are maybe thinking about them in the current moment, or maybe used to hearing about them in the current set of circumstances, but I really don't think this was all that bad of a performance from DK, barring some major mistakes in game number 3, which obviously they got trounced in, but that game number 2 was really good. We'll get to that, but for Gen.G, they still looked really good, and player of the series for me is going to go to Chovy in the mid lane. He's actually very quietly having a phenomenal split. I don't know if it's quiet. I've just talked about Paze so much on this channel up until this point. I've been so boisterous, loud about how I think that Paze has really, stepped up and been the guy in the LCK so far in the summer split, but Chovy has, quietly been just as good, if not better, for this team, or at least more consistent. I think Paze has obviously been great, but Chovy just sets things up for him in such a way that I don't think Paze would be as good if he didn't get to play with Chovy, and that's not to say that Paze still doesn't deserve all the credit. I don't think Chovy would be as good if he didn't get to play with Peanut, in that same kind of, vein, a player that really wants to give a lot of the resources over to the mid lane, but man, you watch him play Ahri in game number 3, and I know it's cliche to say something like this, and so I'm hesitant to say it on the channel, but you watch him play Ahri, and you just have to take a step back and be like, man, I'm so lucky I get to watch Chovy play Ahri in the LCK. He's just so good. He's just so freaking good at League of Legends that I honestly feel very excited that we get to watch him play, and play on a very good team like this, go to 6-0 after their first 6 series. He's just awesome, and to me, very clearly was the best player in this series. I know, you look at the scoreline, 1-2-19, and you're like, maybe he wasn't the carry. No, he was the carry. You just gotta watch the games. He was really fantastic across this whole series. Peanut was also great, and Peanut is someone who I think, again, is just gonna never get the kind of flowers that he deserves in terms of longevity and in terms of, legacy in the LCK and in the LPL and everywhere that he's played. He's not gonna get the kind of recognition that he deserves for what he's been able to do, but he's one of the greatest junglers of all time, and he continues to play at a really high level, and he does it even on carries now. I know that obviously he's transitioned out of being a more primary primary carry-oriented kind of jungler and into a supportive jungler, and that's kind of how we see him, especially in the context of this Gen.G team. But Kha'Zix in game number 1, he was not a supportive jungler. He was taking resources, and he was blowing people up. Really good stuff. Peanut is still an elite level jungler, a top, I don't know, 3 in the world. Somewhere around there, maybe number 1 in the LCK, just a really, really good player. And Peanut and Chovy obviously play off of each other in such an incredible way that it really makes them both some of the best players in the entire world. Paze and Delight continued to be great. I mean, Delight was 0-0-22. That's about the dream scoreline for him in this situation. And Paze was pretty fantastic as well. Love to see the increase in prio and things like the Tristana. We've been seeing that in the LPL quite frequently, especially by some teams more than others. OMG, I'm looking at you, but Paze definitely looks really good on this pick. It gives you a lot more lane agency, and it gives you the opportunity to actually try and push your lead a little bit more, and obviously it offers a little bit of flexibility if you want to move it mid lane as well, and so I like it from Gen.G. Basically everybody on this team playing at a high level and looking really fun right now. As for DK though, I think a lot of people are going to be doom and gloom about this team. They're 3-3. Oh my god, they're not a Worlds team. They're losing their minds. This team sucks. You got to blow it up. You know, blame Kana, even though he's the best player in this series. You know, whatever, right? Whatever narrative people are going to spin. DK fans are very quickly, in my opinion, almost surpassing T1 fans in terms of doom and gloom and just unnecessary sadness for their team, because they're fine. They're going to be fine. They took a game off of Gen.G. Game 2 actually was pretty good. Canyon played really well on the Kha'Zix, and Kana looked very good on the Gragas. That top side of the map was definitely a power part of the team, but I don't love the drafts coming out in game number 3. A lot of people are criticizing giving Gen.G everything they wanted, and I agree. Like, you don't really want to give the enemy team all of their best picks, but what I'm more concerned about is the idea behind what DK did end up drafting, which is like super late game, Sejuani, Azir, Jinx. Like, I don't like this. This is not the style that they really like to play. It's not what's really gotten the best out of their players, and I think they struggle to play that style, but that's what gives me the confidence that they're going to be able to figure this out. Canyon's going to get my dud of the series, and I feel really bad because he was actually really good in game number 2 on the Kha'Zix, but he was pretty miserable on the Viego and then again on the Sejuani, and so I kind of have to give it to him in this context. And, you know, I think a lot of people are just going to overreact to the week that he had. I don't think he was very good this week. Definitely going to be a contender for Dud of the Week, but he's fine as a player. He's still going to be fine. Showmaker had a little bit of a rough series, could have done significantly more damage in some of these team fights, but he's actually been fantastic to start the split, in my opinion. You won't know that by going on Reddit, but he's arguably been one of the better mid laners in the league to start this split, especially in lane, in basically all the games that he's played. Deft and Kellen are great early on in lane, but you give them a Felios and Jinx every game into Tristana, like, the bot lane that's really good at the 2v2 all of a sudden doesn't have the tools to be able to play out the 2v2, and so I think a lot of the problems that DK ran into here were just prep and draft, and I think those are very fixable problems. This team has an identity. They kind of know what they want to do, which for the most part, in a lot of their wins, has been generating an early lead and just kind of snowballing the game out of control. If they can get back to that, like, they've already shown that they can compete, you know, talent-wise with a team like Gen.G. I'm not ready to give up on them yet, and I know that, you know, a lot of people are going to criticize me for that, but I don't think this team is really all that bad, even if they did go 0-2 this week. But Gen.G is the best team in the league at the current moment. They continue to stay undefeated. Chovy, Paze, they're both MVP contenders, maybe the top 2 in terms of MVP vote getters for me right now. Peanut had a killer series. Delight has stepped up and been more consistent. Doran was awesome earlier this week and was good in this one as well. Gen.G just looks really good and legitimately almost unstoppable at the current moment. And then moving on to our second series of day number 4 here, and this was the one we were all looking forward to. I can't remember a telecom war that was this hype. We had T1 taking on KT Rolster, and they did it. They overcame their demons. KT Rolster was able to take the clean, mind you, 2-0 series win. Oh my god, am I in a hallucination? Am I alive right now? Am I losing my mind? Because KT just beat T1, and that's something they have not been able to do for quite a long time here in the LCK. Man, I cover every single game, and so you really start to feel it. You really start to feel the age of KT losing to this team over and over and over again, but not this time. They were the better team, and their success right now is really starting to shine through. A lot of the movement that this team has done in the positive direction in the last few months, the consistency that they have gained, it all came to fruition in this series for me. I'm incredibly proud of these players, of this team, because they have launched themselves into the stratosphere. It is not a top 2 in the LCK. It is very clearly a top 3, and KT has proven time and time again that they are a part of the best teams in the LCK. Incredibly excited for them. Let's go ahead and talk about what they did this series, though. My player of the series, no-brainer. Gonna go to Keen in the top lane. God, he's been good for this team this split. You know, I wasn't gonna say that I was worried about him on KDF, because obviously he was mentally checked out, and man, I said it a lot last split, but I really was worried about his ability to come into this team and be this big takeover carry top laner, kind of like he had been in his prime, right? I just didn't know if he was gonna be that guy. I thought he was gonna be good, but I didn't know if he was gonna be that guy, most specifically because Cuz and BDD as a jungle mid duo did worry me a little bit, and I was worried about the fit between Aiming and Lehens, and there were other pieces on this team that I just wasn't as convinced by. I still ranked him, I think, as my second top laner going into the year, only behind Zeus, but man, he's been phenomenal. He's been arguably the best top laner in the LCK. I mean, Zeus definitely still has an argument for that over the course of the whole year, but Keen in this series was definitely better, and he's just gotten more and more consistent. Every single series, it feels like I'm bringing him up. He's the star of KT Rolster. You can talk about almost anybody else here playing well, and everyone did, but Keen is the focal point. That Malphite game in Game 2, I mean, consistently just finding premier targets every fight with no escapability and being able to latch onto them and basically win the fight by himself for KT Rolster. Just incredibly great stuff. Keen is awesome, and I love to watch him play. Aiming and Lehens were fantastic. Aiming in particular looked really good in this series. It almost feels like he's becoming a little bit of the forgotten man on this team, and that's not a negative towards him, right? It's just that this team, I think, plays towards bot lane a little bit less than other teams, and I kind of am okay with that in terms of the perception and the way that this team is constructed. Cuz and BDD have a great duo synergy together, and BDD likes to get resources, or he likes to be the one to use those resources to move around the map like he did on the Twisted Fate in game number 2, but they don't really play for bot lane, and Aiming has kind of been the one that has to take a step back in terms of the spotlight for that. Even Lehens, I think, has really stepped up in a lot of series and really made his presence known, but Aiming was the guy in this series in terms of damage and in terms of carry potential. When he's your weak link, like, and he's not, I'm not going to try to say he's the weak link of this team, but when he's the player that you're talking about the least on KT Rolster, that should go to show you the kind of form that they are in, because he's a very, very good player, and someone who I've talked about over the year, just getting more and more consistent, kind of getting rid of any sort of past trepidations I had on him as a player, but he's been awesome. Lehens has been great, already given him a ton of player of the series over the course of the year. BDD was an MVP finalist for me last split, you know, the only one not for T1 that was an MVP finalist for me last split, and Cuz has been great for this team. KT is just rolling, and they've got the superstar talent to back it up. This is a scary team. And then for T1 on the other side, just not able to go up against KT Rolster. That really was what it was, is this team wasn't as good as KT in this series, and it was every lane. It wasn't one particular player. I had to give a dud to the series because that's what we do on this channel, but one individual player did not lose them this series. Everybody lost, and everybody got outplayed. My dud of the series is going to go to Zeus in the top lane, because I think it was the most noticeable that the Cassante really wasn't all that relevant towards the back half of Game 2, but again, you know, no one loves to hate on Zeus more than T1 fans, and I'm certainly not in that camp. The amount of times that I bring up Zeus as like this very sneakily great player on this team, and even the times I don't bring him up because other players on this team are playing well, 9 out of 10 of his games are really good, right? They're fantastic, and he's one of the best top laners in the world. He's going to have bad ones every once in a while. He's still an incredibly young player, and he is an aggressive player, so when those games go bad, they usually go really bad, and that's kind of what happened here going up against a good player in Keen. The Cassante just really couldn't keep up. It's going to happen, but man, it's the doom and gloom and the black and white narratives that surround not just T1, but everything in the LCK that just make me really upset. Life isn't black and white. A player is not good or bad. There is nuance in every situation, and Zeus has been far from the worst thing in the world for T1, even if he wasn't great in this series. Owner definitely took a step back. He wasn't great. 2 carry-oriented picks that just didn't end up working out, and this was probably Gumayushi's worst series of the year. That was really the player that I took a step back and been like, oh, okay, he kind of got blasted in lane by Aiming. Really was not all that close, and so T1 honestly just getting outskilled. Really not a lot else to say besides that. It's certainly something to keep in mind, but this team has not started out Summer Split in the same kind of way that you would want them to, and it really does feel like maybe their loss to BLG at MSI is, you know, a little bit more critical than maybe we took an eye to, and so it'll be interesting to see how they bounce back. I'm certainly not going to give up on this team and the talent that they have, but KT Rolster, I feel all in on right now. This might be a top 2 team in the league, and this is a team that I think we're at the point where it's not, are they going to go to Worlds? It's, if they go to Worlds and when they go to Worlds, what kind of damage are they going to be able to do? Because this really could be a top 2, top 3 team in the world. And now we get to jump into our 5th and final day here in the LCK in week number 3, and we kicked it off with a battle between 2 teams near the bottom of the standings. We had Nongshim RedForce taking on DRX, And DRX picks up their first series win of the split here with a win over Nongshim. Incredibly excited for them. You gotta be happy for this team, and you've just gotta be excited for them, just in general. I can't imagine the mental pressure that is being put on you as a team that had expectations going into the season and just has not really at all been able to live up to them, even a little bit. And so, really excited to see DRX take this series. Just gotta be happy for them, but their players did play well, and it's definitely worth pointing out. Juhan and Fate, for those who are keeping track, remained in here. It looks like they're going to be moving forward with these two as the jungle mid duo, which is totally fine by me. I actually think this is probably the right call. I mean, Yehu really wasn't all that bad. He certainly wasn't great, but Fade is a player who has played well at the LCK level before, so I understand wanting to move in that direction, and fans have been clamoring for Juhan for quite a long time in that jungle position. Now, Krako has just not been it for this DRX team. So again, I understand the decision, and at least in this series, there were some good moments, mostly from Fate in the mid lane. Juhan was fine, probably the weakest member of this team in terms of individual performances, although Rascal certainly had some bad ones as well, especially in that game number 1. But player of the series for me is going to go to Paddock in the bot lane. Really excited to be able to say that. He is just a fireball of an AD carry. He's really somebody who is clearly not bred to play that position. Of course, mechanically speaking, he is incredibly talented, and he's someone who is, able to step in and out of fights. And on a champion like Zeri, I think it really does capitalize and play to a lot of his strengths as a player, but man, he can step a little bit too far forward sometimes, and that's really going to be his kryptonite as an LCK player. But when he has the team backing him up, and especially when he has the damage to be able to take a lot of these fights, he's going to look phenomenal. And for me, he was definitely the standout member. Probably the player on this team that, at least in 2023, I'm the most interested in seeing. Obviously, moving into the future, players like Rascal and Beryl should be fine. Well, Beryl, I don't know. Obviously, I've talked about Beryl extended on this channel, even going back to last year, saying how I'm lower on him as a player. But, Rascal should be better. A player like Fate should probably be better. But Paddock certainly shows like some level of upside and is certainly a fun player to watch, and we saw a bit of that in this series. But Fate was also really good in the mid lane here. He really has been, kind of rolling ever since he came back. He wasn't very good in that first series, but, this series was really, really good. And honestly, he played the map incredibly well. When Fate was playing at his best for teams like KDF or any of the other teams that he's played for in the past, most recently, obviously, he's been a supportive mid laner, somebody who wants to shove and roam and get out on the map and help his jungler. And while that's not necessarily the style that DRX is probably going to want to go for, Juhan definitely more of a supportive jungler in general. I think that Fate is a player that can definitely have some upside for this roster, and he kind of showed it off a bit in this series, and so good stuff from him. Him and Paddock were definitely the two standout members, I would say, but Beryl was actually really good in this series. Really good to see him play well, just in general. I don't feel like he's done that at all in 2023, so finally, a good Beryl series. That's good to see. And then, like I said, topside was probably the most up and down part of this series. Juhan had some good engages, but also some bad ones, and Rascal was miserable on the volley bear in game number 1, but definitely turned it around once he got on the Renekton in the final 2 games, and so positives and negatives to take away, but DRX winning the series is definitely a positive and something they're going to be excited about. And then for Nongshim on the other side, they're just not the kind of team that's very good right now. They're really not in good form, and their problems are starting to show. I consider them a worse version of the Kwangdong Freecs at the current moment. The KDF has really struggled with being able to close out games and being consistent in terms of their macro towards the back half of series. Nongshim struggles with that, but even worse, and they don't have the mechanical talent to be able to generate the same kind of leads that KDF does, and so they're really just going to struggle in general. I think Fiesta played relatively okay. He stepped in and was the starter here instead of Quad in the mid lane. I liked Fiesta a lot in the Challengers League, but he was maybe the single worst mid laner in the LCK last split, so that's something to keep in mind. But again, on that Azir in game number 1, he did play relatively well, and even though he wasn't great on the chase in game number 3, I still don't think he was the biggest problem for this team, and probably the most standout member in my eyes. But Jiwoo and Peter continue to be fine. I think Jiwoo is a very talented player, but the Varus can only do so much, and then Peter, I think, is a fine support, maybe not a star at this level as much as I wanted him to be by the end of 2022, but he's okay enough to be able to play at this level. It's the top side that's really not been very good. Mid lane's obviously been a problem, but he was okay this series. My dud of the series is going to go to Sylvie in the jungle, who just continues to show that he's not really cut out for this level. There are a lot of junglers in this league that I think have good and bad moments, ups and downs. There's no real, super consistent, fantastic jungler outside of maybe Peanut, but even then, he's got his detractors for sure, and Sylvie, I think, definitely shows a lot of negatives. He just doesn't have the positives that go with a lot of the other junglers in the league, and so Really just someone who, even if he did have a lot of hype, and even if I did like his tape a lot in Challengers, has just not shown an ability to play at this level really all that consistently in the recent weeks. And then Din's whatever on the top side. I don't really believe in him as an LCK top laner, but maybe he can turn some things around. He was okay in game 1 on the Renekton. That was certainly something to keep in mind, but the rest of that series, he was basically irrelevant out of that top side. And so for Nongshim, they're one of the worst teams in the league. The bottom 3 are really all very difficult to distinguish because obviously DRX has beaten Nongshim, Nongshim has beaten BRION, and BRION has beaten Dplus KIA. And so, you know, all of them sitting at 1 win is very difficult. That could change in the next series, obviously, but, you know, Nongshim definitely not proving to be above any of the other teams that they're in the bottom 3 with. And then, congratulations to DRX for getting their first win, but it is against one of the worst teams in the entire league, and a team that realistically, on paper, they absolutely should be beating. They just have not been in that state recently, and so it's good for DRX, but they're going to have to do a lot more than beat Nongshim for me to feel anything other than apathy about them. And then moving on to our final series of the week here, our second series of day number 5, and it's a matchup between OK BRION and Hanwha Life Esports. And Hanwha does pick up the 2-0 series win here. Good stuff from this team. And again, it continues to be the same story. A couple of players really stepping up, although I do want to give them a lot of credit. This might be the single best series that they have played in summer so far. They were super consistent. They were super coordinated. Their macro was actually really good, and I think they did everything they needed to do in this series to separate themselves. And so I'm really proud of this team, but there are still questions about whether or not they can do it against a team that isn't Bro, who just isn't very good, if we're being entirely honest. And so congratulations to Hanwha for picking up the win, but got to see it a little bit more consistently. For now, let's talk about the positives. Player of the series for me, pretty obviously, is going to go to Zeka in the mid lane. 2 games of Yone, and he looked phenomenal on this pick. He was incredibly explosive in lane and out of lane. His team fighting potential is massive. Of course, he's beaten the 2-trick allegations for many moons now. He was super good on a bunch of picks at Worlds, a bunch of different styles of play, and so we know that Zeka's a really good player. Anybody who's still in doubt and who still doesn't believe that is just not watching. Like, there really is no other way to say it. They're just not actually giving a shit enough to make an actual, you know, educated opinion, I guess I should say. Zeka's really good. He's been really good. I know a lot of times mid laners get blamed when their junglers aren't exactly exuding a ton of pressure. See Zeka last year on on DRX with Pioshik, but he's always been this good of a player. He's just finally getting an opportunity to actually show everybody how good he actually is. World-class mid, won the World Finals for a reason, and so Zeka, player of the series, looking good. Viper and Life continue to develop a much better chemistry than anything they really had in spring, although they did get a lot better towards the back half of spring. I think that form has definitely carried over into summer, which is a really good thing for fans of Hanwha Life, because you're going to need Viper to step up and be that big carry, but Zeka, Viper, still one of the scarier carry duos in the entire league and in the entire world, because both of them honestly are playing really well right now. And that's something that I think a lot of teams have to take into consideration. But the player that I'm very quickly going to touch on that actually was really big in this series was Klid in the jungle. Again, not endorsing anything he did, but he played well on 2 games of Sejuani. Really kind of the cohesion that came with this team, and Klid not insta-running it down in the series was a big reason why they were able to take it. I'm not saying Klid has been anything but, you know, up and down for this team, because I think, again, not to praise him, because I hate to praise a guy like this, but he has been someone that I think has had a lot more positives than people give him credit for. He's just struggled against the better junglers in the league. His feast or famine playstyle doesn't necessarily translate well into playing some of the more controlled styles and controlled teams and coordinated teams in the league, but he's dominated the bottom half of the league all year long, and so to see him do it again here, it's not particularly surprising. Honestly, he was a really big factor as to why Hanwha Life was actually, you know, the 5th seed in the playoffs and not out of the playoffs in the regular season last split, and so I'm not shocked to see Klid play well against a bad team. He's done it all year long, but it's the good teams that you really need to watch out for with him. But Kingen was fine, Zeka was a star, Viper was really good, and Klid played coordinated, and that's all Hanwha Life needs to be able to pick up a win. They've got the talent to be able to capitalize. They just need the opportunity. And then for Bro, again, I don't know how much I can really say here. They're just not very good. They're an okay team at best. Ivory's going to get my dud of the series. He just has not been very good since stepping in. It's not like Karis was good for this team either. He was one of, if not the worst mid laner in the league at the start of summer, but Ivory has been just about as bad for this team. They really can't catch a break in that mid lane position. He has not been able to hold up, especially at that position where you're basically playing, you know, superstar talent every single game. And so For Ivory, you're hoping that maybe he can figure something out, or you're just going to have to hope that he doesn't ruin the season too much, but it's not like Bro was going to go too far. Nobody else on this team is really playing all that well. Hanwha had some moments in this series where he looked okay, but his scoreline is way better than I think his actual performance in my eyes. Effort has actually been a lot better. I think he had moments this week where he actually looked pretty good, and honestly, he looked like the best member of Bro for both of their series this week, but I don't know how sustainable that is. He's been one of the worst supports in the LCK for years now. And then Morgan and Umti were whatever. They were probably the most noticeable topside problems. Umti, just not a good player at this level. The Rek'Sai certainly didn't work in game one, and then Morgan's whatever, right? He's just fine. He can have really good games, and I think if you put better talent around him, he would look like a better player. You know, I think he's a slightly worse version of Dudu, who I've talked about a lot this week, and so good things to say, I would say, about a couple of these players. You know, Henna and Effort were okay, especially Effort, but the top side of this map was disastrous, and it was a big reason why they ended up losing. So, Bro, still pretty bad, and certainly nothing this week that ended up changing my thoughts on that. And Hanwha Life, still looking exactly like they did last split. They're a team that consistently was able to beat the worst teams in the league, but weren't able to really hang with the best teams in the league, at least consistently. Now, the upside is there. Zeka and Viper, like I said, are one of the scariest carry duos in the entire world, but it's going to be the ancillary pieces that really determine where this team ends up going. Alright, but that is going to do it for my LCK Week 3 overview and analysis of all 5 days. Up on the screen right now, you're going to see the updated LCK standings after the first 3 weeks. Any ties will just be broken alphabetically. We've only got one left in the standings in terms of game score as well. Of course, in the first column to the right, you're going to see my updated power rankings. In the second column, you're going to see how those have changed from last week to this week. We can go over the risers and the fallers, any changes. The big change is going to be at number 2 because KT won that telecom war, and they won it decisively enough so where I'm going to put them up at the number 2 spot in the power rankings. This is going to be a very volatile top 3 for me. It really does feel like a top 3, though. The top 3 teams feel very isolated from everybody else in terms of consistency. That means T1 drops out of the top 2. They drop down to number 3. I'm not sure how long they're going to stay there, but at least for now, they deserve to be there. They were not able to beat Gen.G. They were not able to beat KT. And so they're number 3 in the power rankings. This is a team that absolutely should be better than that, but at the moment they're not. And congratulations to KT. This is the highest they have ever been in a Super K-Man Rocks power ranking. 4 through 7 stay the same, and again, I know people are going to be so frustrated with this because DK had a rough week, but they played the 2 best teams in the league, and I still think that I'm going to be more of a wait-and-see approach on Hanwha Life because I don't know what they're going to do with the jungle position. If they get, you know, a challenger's jungler to come in and play for them, somebody who's never had experience that might struggle there because I don't know what's going to happen with Klid. Maybe he suffers no consequences, but for now, I want to be a little bit of a wait-and-see approach, and honestly, I wouldn't have moved them even if anything happened. I still trust DK to be able to figure it out more than I trust Hanwha to be able to do anything, and I know that's going to be my kryptonite, and maybe it's going to come back to bite me like as the season goes on, but for now, it's just the way I feel. Liiv SANDBOX is going to stay at 6, and KDF is going to stay at 7. I'd love to be able to swap these guys, but KDF's got to be able to beat them, and we're going to be able to find out when those two go up against each other. And then bottom 3 feels pretty locked in for me. They're going to move around, but they are the worst 3 teams in the league. DRX is going to jump up to number 8 from number 10. They just have the most upside of anybody. If they figure it out, they have the most talent, so they're going to be at number 8. Nongshim and Bro are at 9 and 10. You can put them wherever you want. Nongshim beat Bro, which is why I have them at 9 and why I have Bro at 10, but you can honestly put them in whatever order you want. This is just what I feel the most confident saying at the current moment, and so those are my power rankings. Let me know what I'm crazy about. I know you guys are going to have different opinions than mine, so let me know down in the comment section below, but of course, be respectful, be courteous when it comes to the conversation. But time to jump into my player of the week and my dud of the week for week number 3. My player of the week was actually a 2-horse race, a very difficult decision, but I ended up landing on Keen, the top laner for KT Rolster. He was fantastic this week. He's going to be my week 3 player of the week. Really not a lot else to say. He just dominates lane and he translates it really well into team fights, and there just aren't a lot of top laners in the league that play the same style that he does or are as successful as he's able to be in that, you know, kind of role. And so for KT, I think they really value him and he's become the superstar of that team. So Keen getting player of the week in week 3. Zeka was also in consideration. He was the other player that you really had to mention, but I think Keen edges him out just a little bit, but Zeka also had a really good week here in week number 3. I think that's the 3rd week in a row that Zeka's gotten an honorable mention for player of the week. Should go to show you how good he's been. But as for dud of the week, unfortunately, I had to give it out to a player that I really like and I think will bounce back, but I had to be honest, for week number 3, my dud of the week is going to go to Canyon, the jungler for Dplus KIA. He just had a pretty rough week, and while he did have a decent game towards the back half of the week, he wasn't able to actually capitalize on that by doing anything anything else against Gen.G, and so DK's Canyon is going to get my dud of the week, and there really weren't a lot of other players that I was actually considering for this. Ivory, I think, definitely was in consideration for Bro, but felt like too easy of a target. I think Canyon being my dud of the week in week 3, and Keen being my player of the week in week 3 are definitely the decisions that I want to go with, but that is going to do it. If you guys enjoyed, let me know down in the comments section below. Of course, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button and hit that bell so you can be notified when these videos go live. I post about the LCK every single week on this channel, and not only the LCK, I cover all 4 of the major regions as well as the NACL, so if you're interested in comprehensive LoL esports coverage, this is the place for it. Like I said, subscribe, hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos go live, and of course, if you enjoyed the video, hit the like button. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it helps get this video out to a lot more people as well, so I would be really appreciative if you did that. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all